Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our employment salon on job carving and employment services. We are doing this series of salons to discuss, especially focus on partnerships between public, private, third sector, and we have different topics that we like to discuss. Today, it's the topic of inclusive employment or job carving, job crafting. My name is Miguel Peromingo. I'm together with Eamon Davern. We started this initiative to discuss partnerships and go maybe a little bit beyond the public sector, which is well covered in other networks, and to include more also people from outside public networks, but the public network as well. And today we have a series of speakers who will be sharing their experiences, theoretical, but mainly also practical, on job carving initiatives. We have from the head, from the European Center for Social Welfare, we have Anette Scopetta, who is the head of work and welfare at the European Center for Social Welfare. You have written, I think, extensively on social inclusion and partnerships, and you have a focus on innovative tools, one of them being job carving, and we will come and discuss with you in a second after the introduction. We have Esmeralda Micallef Zarafa. I hope I pronounced that correctly. You're the CEO. Oh, thank you. You're the CEO of the Lino Spiteri Foundation from Malta, who is a public social partnership between the Employment and Training Corporation in Malta and the Empower Corporation Limited. You enhance inclusion through empowering individuals and working closely also with the civil society. And you're here with your colleagues, Katia Cortis and Tania Azzopardi. If you want to switch on your camera, you can, yeah, so as you like, but you can also leave it on. And we have you brought also an employee you cooperated with, Mateus Grasso, founder of A New Better Life. It's a fitness center. You're a fitness coach there as well. And your company helps clients to become fitter, to lose body fat, to tone the body, and you're cooperated with the Lino Spiteri Foundation on job carving initiative. We will hear about that later on. And we have Brian Smyth, the Deputy CEO from the Leitrim Development Company in Ireland. You're a charity program promoting social and enterprise development, especially to facilitate rural and urban regeneration community work. So welcome to you all. Thanks for your time, for coming. To me, the topic of job carving was rather new. From the theoretical point of view, it was new. I read a little bit about it and had a couple of discussions. So I found interesting that basically when we look at jobs, we very often historically look at jobs more from a production side or a service rendering side, like how can the clients be satisfied, how can the service be delivered effectively, efficiently. So there's kind of more the economic point of view, but it leaves out a little bit the part of the story, which is how the actual people who deliver the job, the employees, the freelancers, people who work in jobs, how they feel the jobs and how accessible they are. And this is so rather looking more at the skills side, not so much at the results side. And I think this is something that job carving, job crafting addresses very well. And there's two aspects that kind of stood out for me that caught my attention. One is the accessibility of jobs, that many jobs are not accessible as they are because people will not have or will not be considered to have the right skill set to do a specific job, or because they're considered to be too far away from the labor market. They often are, and they're not employable enough for a specific job. And while this is kind of a society issue that needs to be addressed, it's often also, I think, the accessibility is also due to the architecture of the job. Some jobs are simply not accessible because of the way they are, because of the way they are conceived, because of the way they are intended. So I think this is where job carving comes in and makes an interesting go on trying to redesign a job or redesign tasks within a job that make it more accessible to people that normally would not maybe have and access to it. So I think it's important to skill up people, but it's also important to not take jobs as they are for granted, but look at how can jobs be designed in a way that they are more accessible. And that's quite an effective strategy, I think, for a more inclusive world of work, and also as opposed to purely sheltering jobs that are created in a kind of bubble that is not really the labor market, and can catch people there for a long time, and then it's difficult for them to get out. But it also has another aspect which I find also personally interesting, and that's maybe more the aspect of job crafting, if I understand it right, which refers more to a practice of the employees taking things into their hands and kind of redesigning the job so that they can contribute better to it and that they're more satisfied. So there is more about job satisfaction. And then I thought about myself, that I've been basically job crafting my jobs for quite a long time, and that that was a bit of a shift in my work life when I shifted from complaining about my job to trying to shape the job in a way that I can contribute better to it, and that it would kind of fit me better. So, for example, in adjusting single tasks, in working more widely on the relations you have with coworkers, in thinking of how can I offer my specific talents better into the job I'm doing, rather than hopping to another job, and maybe also see which coworkers are the most inspiring, with whom can I get together, and how can I shift within my area of control and influence to a job delivery that is more satisfying and also more better for the company, basically. So today we will, I think, speak more about the inclusive part of work design, so more the job carving side, and especially also in the European Union, given your backgrounds. I just, to conclude my introduction, would like to share some recommendations that I saw from a Canadian inclusion charity that works with job crafting, and I found that interesting. So 5 success factors that they listed was, first of all, to understand the job seeker. So like take it from the job seeker side rather than mainly from how the job is done. Check the accommodations, like how can it be more accessible as a whole accessibility concept of a specific job. Then know the labor market needs, something that is forgotten sometimes when we look just at the job seeker. So don't forget about the labor market needs, and understand the business perspective also from the employer side, which I think is crucial to understand what they want and what is a good business model for them. And then lastly, and I think very important, to build a relationship between all the people involved, not just the employment service, not just the job seeker, not just the employer, but build a relationship from the beginning. So yeah, that's just as a few thoughts I'd like to share. So from that, I would like to move straight into discussion. And with that, over to you, Eamon, to moderate the discussion. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Miguel, for a very comprehensive and helpful introduction. Annette, would first like to start perhaps having a bit of a discussion with you about some of the concepts behind job carving, which certainly seems to really be an idea that's kind of found its time at the moment. There's an increasing amount of discussion about job carving, particularly being viewed as a very, very suitable policy approach to all the massive changes happening in the labour market and the world of work at the moment. Perhaps firstly, Annette, could you perhaps give us a little bit of a flavour for what are the most widespread forms of job carving in Europe at the moment, from your knowledge? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Eamon. Also, thank you, Miguel, for a nice introduction to this quite interesting topic. And as you rightly said, Eamon, it's increasingly getting more and more interest, or I receive also more and more interest in job carving during the recent years. And I think there were quite a lot of different concepts surrounding job carving. And when we have made a kind of a small research in terms of looking at the different EU countries and their practices and what they really implement already within Europe, then I would say what we find is you have some key elements that some of the countries implement already, but what is missing quite substantially across Europe, with some exceptions. Now Malta is here, and I also would name other countries, is the holistic approach to job carving. I think this is exactly where Europe is really having and lagging behind, because there are some elements which public employment services or NGOs working for the public side, public service providers, who really try to integrate and help people and assist people to enter the labor market offer. But what we don't have is the holistic pictures, like really having different elements accompanying the whole process from the integration chain, starting from the point of view of and the needs and the talents of the job seekers to what the needs of the business are. And not just ending it by matching those two demands, but also by really accompanying them on a longer level, on a longer, on a longer row, like half a year afterwards, still checking what are the needs of the employer still, and what is the employee, the new re-entered employee, really needing. So we have a kind of a picture across Europe, I would say, which, with exception of some countries, taking only some very limited elements out of it, which they would also rename, or they don't name it job carving or job crafting. They name it like reorientation, or your job design was already mentioned. We also have workplace innovation as a kind of a topic which comes in here. So there are quite a lot of different terms used, but the holistic picture and the holistic approach taken is really limited in Europe. Malta, as said, Flanders, in Belgium, we have some examples in Lithuania, we have some examples also in Germany. I think this is exactly the point where we should focus today. It's like this broad view on which other different elements are included in the job carving, and not just the limited designing or reintegration measure or coaching measure, but taking the complete integration chain as an important point.
Okay, thank you, Annette. Picking up the point then of identifying people who can most benefit from these kind of initiatives, which, as you said, come under a number of different titles essentially. But what target groups are mostly being approached, or which groups of citizens are mostly being involved in these programs, from your knowledge, perhaps in the countries that you've mentioned? Who are these initiatives focused at?
Within Europe, you mean?
Within Europe, yeah.
Now here, I mean, Esmeralda will then inform. It's persons with disabilities as the one main target group where we see projects and programs developed. Others are, if we go, for instance, to Flanders, where long-term unemployed people are targeted mainly. We can also see some activities for older people or for migrant workers. So the job carving practice, if you take it as such, can be adjusted to a diverse target group. It's not really the core of it's not something which is dedicated to one specific target group, because it focuses, and I think this is the most important point, to the talents and the need of the individual, whatever they are, whoever they come from. It's really that we look at trying to see those talents and needs in the forefront. It's a person-centered approach, and that's why it can be used for different target groups, practiced as present persons with disabilities, long-term unemployed.
Thank you. The person-centered approach is probably one very good reason why job carving is becoming increasingly seen as a very helpful way of approaching the kind of labour market problems at the moment. But so it can be applied perhaps to people from lots of different backgrounds and situations. Are there particular industries or sectors, Annette, do you think, that lend themselves more to the job carving approach? I mean, could it be applied possibly in any kind of job or sector? Or do you think there's certain parts of the economy where it really makes more sense and it's easy to implement?
We didn't see any sector from what we saw from our practices where it couldn't be applied. It can be applied in quite different sectors. As said, in the center stands the person and of course the employer who together then craft or carve the job. But this can be done in any sector. It can be in the service sector in a similar way than it can be in the production sector. It really depends on how to carve and what is carved. The sector is, out of my point of view, what I've seen, not really the limitation, I would say.
Well, that's incredibly helpful, and we're going to learn more, I think, about a couple of rather different sectors a bit further on into our discussion. But perhaps finally, Annette, from this initial opening part of our discussion this morning, how do you think European funds can be applied to kind of facilitate and encourage job carving initiatives? Have you seen any good examples of funds being used in a creative way to help this kind of happen?
Yeah, I think the European funds have an advantage, which is that you can use them quite broadly. So it's not just limited to a specific type of or element of an integration chain. You can really do quite a lot. And if I now refer back to the 5 success factors, which have been mentioned from Miguel, from the Canadians colleagues, I would say it starts really from I take now the last one, the relationship building, since I think this is core for the whole process. ESF, for instance, European Social Fund, can be used also for building up these relationships. And we talked about partnerships just before. Partnerships are core for many different active labor market policy measures, because there is the understanding that not a single institution can really deliver person-centered approaches to the way that people who have are lagging behind a bit in terms of that, there's not so much self-confidence or whatever, and there is assistance provided. Partnerships really can do a lot. So this relationship is something which can be funded from the funds. The matching process as such, of course, but the majority, I would say, what I've seen is the consultancy which is provided with European funds to the employers in order to help them define what job or profile or position can be carved. There is an understanding needed from the employers that with this kind of approach, persons with disabilities, just give this example, easily and nicely fit into the team of the company. So there is also kind of still, unfortunately, kind of employers they hesitate to take persons who are not 100% fit and employ them. So with the help of these structural funds, these kind of consulting processes to employers, much can be done, and then the whole range of job coaching can also be funded, job orientation, and of course, last but not least, training. Very important.
Thank you. So perhaps the kind of Canadian tests which Miguel mentioned in our introduction could be very usefully considered by some of the managing authorities actually as a way of seeing the potential benefits from job carving. Thank you very much, Annette. That's a very, very helpful kind of introduction to some of the concepts behind job carving. Annette mentioned just a little moment ago that it can be applied across many, many sectors. Quite recently, I had the pleasure of being involved in a discussion with Brian and some colleagues from the Irish Republic, looking at the issue of rural depopulation. And one of the initiatives being developed in Ireland is a program called social farming, where people who've had some kind of past difficulties, perhaps problems with mental health issues and others, and have fallen out of the labour market, are being able to kind of reintegrate because of their involvement in the social farming initiative. So perhaps if I could bring Brian into the discussion now and ask him a couple of questions. Okay, Brian, first of all, what were the origins of the program in Ireland that you're leading at the moment? How did it actually commence?
I suppose it came out of European research with University College Dublin from our perspective, but it looks at the connection between the natural environment, animals, plants, and people, and how that can help rebuild connection for people who've had challenges or have challenges in their lives, who've had mental ill health or in recovery, who have disabilities, who may be disconnected through migration, unemployment, or whatever other issues, who have been in the justice system, of addiction, etc. So the natural environment, the seasons, can help ground people and help rebuild connections, whether it's an interest in something in the environment, food, production. You know, there's a huge variety of things happen on farms and in horticultural settings that can help people build new interest and reconnect in some way. So it's reconnecting with the community around the farm, the activities on the farm, or the the plants and animals which don't demand anything or don't set any precedent, don't see difference, and just take people as they come. So I suppose the concepts are there. The benefits are huge in that, you know, we see care farming, green care, social farming. The benefits are good for wellness, for physical activity, for building routines, you know, and getting people out and about again and connecting with an interest, developing their interests. So we've seen people develop interest in food, photography, you know, in machinery and technology on farms, and also just getting involved in other things like men's sheds or community activities, environmental campaigns. So people become connected and can be built. So that's the concept. So we have spent a number of years building that concept in a practical situation on farms in Ireland, and we have built up, I suppose a cohort of about 150 farmers offering their services to support people. And we have young people who are leaving school early. We have people who have been migrants, asylum seekers, unemployed people, people with mental ill health, people out of the prison system, etc., on farms. And we're sampling it and hoping to build it into the mainstream. And that's succeeding to a greater or lesser extent because it requires policy change, structural and funding change. And I suppose it allows people to carve out a place for themselves in their own community, within their own interests, and in their own journey of, you know, of addressing the challenges they have. So it allows, and it's very much pre-employment. It isn't an employment arrangement, but it's building people's confidence, their health, physical and mental health, their well-being, and building towards the choices they want to make in their lives, whether that is, you know, further training, further skills development, or ultimately for many, it's going into employment as well, or returning to some sort of employment. Some people are going to self-employment. So that's where it sits. It's in that pre-employment stage. And I suppose we've learned a lot in that, you know, it is very, very person-centered. There's a planned approach in that the person attends the farm for a period of time, and they plan what the outcome is of that placement and time is for. And so it's very person-centered, and it's built around a number of other programs that we have in our company, which is a charity. Our focus is on social inclusion and has been for 25 years or so. We have a number of labour market interventions. One of them is called the Rural Social Scheme that works with farmers and farm families and brings them into a community setting to provide some part-time work with community organisations. And so they the community carves out a position that somebody from farm family can take, and they're provided with social welfare support to move into that role as they're unemployed or low-income farm family members. We also have the TUS program, which was brought in after the economic collapse in 2010-12, and that's a one-year labour market intervention for long-term unemployed people to give them this, the routines, I suppose, of getting back to work, and the focus there is going back to work. And then we have community employment programs, which are similar community labour market interventions that employ people for 19.5 hours a week in their local community. And there's a training element built into that. And we operate, I suppose we support about 200 or 250 people across these three programs. Say, for instance, in community employment, we train people in childcare skills to go into the childcare service. So they work part-time in a community childcare or private childcare setting. They build their training skills and then they move into employment, hopefully after the 3 or 4 years. So that's it, where it sits alongside what we do. Also, we have also 3 programs with individual placement and support, IPS. That's a well-evidenced program to support people And we have 2 people working in the mental health service. One is in early intervention in psychosis. So it's dealing with people in the early stages of after the diagnosis of psychosis. And it's to a rapid job search program to help them to get back to work, because it is proven, the evidence shows that recovery is best where people can move back into work as quickly as possible. There's quite a lot of evidence. These programs are quite well established, and we're implementing them with the health service. We're contracted there. We're also just about to start a program there with people with disabilities to get them to help support people into and towards work. So we have 3 staff working on those projects, and very much they're carving out positions, taking existing positions, or looking at an organization, an employer, and seeing where they have gaps or where they could redefine the work they have to make a place for somebody to come in from these cohorts of mainly mental health, people with mental ill health and disabilities. And our staff are developing those skills at the same time. So we're learning about that too at the same time. And obviously our company is integrated, and we're, I suppose, building the understanding, because we live in a very, very rural area where the opportunities may not be as extensive as they are. It's very low level of population. I think it's about 21 persons per square kilometre. So it's very underpopulated. And we have, I suppose we have also a support for people who are unemployed and are seeking self-employment. And there again, people carve up their own interests, decide what they want to do. And in that program, it's a state-funded program where people are allowed to remain on their social welfare payment for a period of time as they build their self-employment and as they experience the ups and downs of that for over a 3-year period. So we have a staff member supporting people to do that. And that's very much carving out a place for themselves. And we see that social enterprises offer that opportunity as well. And we have a program to develop social enterprise with communities mainly. And in their communities can really, when they develop social enterprises and when they take on social enterprise activities, they can carve out, I suppose, innovation and enterprises which provide very much special or carved supports and services that are needed in a particular area, responding to the geographic issues, the challenges of transport and accessibility and that kind of thing. And those organizations can allow people to carve in their own needs and interests to the mainstream, in a way, labor market, because they can get really good jobs that are really vital in rural areas and vital in any area, in fact, and across all the sectors. You know, social enterprise is right across the sector. So we see a lot of a lot of ways for people to carve out. And I suppose our interest in it came out of the social farming project, but it's stretched now across the various activities that we have in our organization. And as you said, Anette, you know, that holistic approach, looking at the community as a whole and their needs and the individuals that are there, but also the sectors, you know, the particular areas in any particular community or area. And you can see the opportunities when you take that view, a holistic view of allowing people to find their place within that. And that's the holistic approach, certainly. So thanks for that.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. That's you've really very nicely elaborated lots of the clear benefits for the individual and also some obvious benefits for the rural economy as well, which seems to be an absolute win-win. Of course, with all programs, one thing that one always has to do is produce some kind of performance metrics for the people who are funding the programs, which is often one of the more challenging kind of areas where the benefits are really quite self-apparent, as you've helpfully described. But coming up with some kind of measurement process is often a bit more difficult or challenging. Could you give us perhaps a couple of examples of the kind of qualitative measures that have to be applied to some of the programs that you've described there, which are used to kind of justify the return on the funding that you receive? So what kind of measures are used to assess the success of these very interesting programs?
And a lot of these programs were set up independently of each other, and they're not necessarily linked at a high level or at a state level or statutory level. And so they kind of define what they require. Some of them were set up after the economic crash so they were very much focused on, you know, employment and the numbers, and, you know, crunching the numbers and the numbers into employment, the types of employment. But I suppose what we've been doing is trying to add, you know, case studies. In social farming in particular, we have a researcher and policy officer, and they're carrying out on an ongoing basis quite a bit of qualitative discussions with participants, with beneficiaries, with the farmers, with the services in education, employment, inclusion, disability and mental health, and documenting that. We designed that ourselves more or less to make sure that we would be able to measure and report on the benefits so that we could influence policy change. And I suppose the others largely would have, you know, their own systems for capturing the KPI, the key performance indicators. And again, you know, we would use the case studies, video diaries and things like that to capture some of the stories from people who take part in these. You know, so it is variable. We have to add, I suppose, the qualitative or dimension to that ourselves in many cases, because it's not necessarily required by the funders. So, and it's only when you're experienced and delivering over a period of time that you can see, I suppose, the added value across, and the integration, the value in integrating these things, and seeing the benefits that come from what is quite a defined program, and that you can see, you know, where they're going and where they might be able to go, and helping to influence that in the longer term. So we do have to take quite a bit of time to reflect what we're actually doing, to see it and to report it and to get the messages out. But it just doesn't necessarily come out of crunching the numbers, which is mainly what the state is after.
Always the kind of dilemma there, the kind of tension between clearly providing a very kind of useful and beneficial program and then proving it to the funders in a way that fits in with their own kind of approach to providing finance for the initiatives. You mentioned, I think, over 150 farmers involved around the network, which is a very impressively high number. How, Brian, did you first start engaging the interest from the farmers to get involved in the program at the very beginning? Because a fascinating idea, very successful, but at the start, people must have thought this was something they perhaps hadn't really seen before. So how did you get them on board and get so much participation?
No real difficulty getting farmers interested and getting them progressed to provide the support, or at least we found that. I suppose there's a couple of key questions at the beginning. Was the safety and insurance issues, liability issues for farmers and anybody, because people are very vulnerable. We have people who have in wheelchairs, people who are non-verbal, people who have quite a variety of challenges within, you know, their own lives, accessing farms, and farms are probably, you know, the most dangerous places it can be on in terms of enterprise in Ireland. So those were the challenges initially in terms of the services and the people who may go out. Farmers are very altruistic and have a very holistic view of what they're doing, because they're, and particularly, like, we have a high percentage of organic farmers, for instance, people who are interested in biodiversity and the environment and wider issues than just economic, commercially driven activity necessarily. And they also have experienced maybe some of the issues themselves with disability or mental health, or have family members who have experience. So we don't find any challenge in finding farmers interested in delivering this support. It's adding value to what they do. It's multi-dimensional activity on farms. Not every farmer is going to do it, obviously, but and farmers are open to, you know, multifunctionality in what they do, because they're providing tourism services, environmental services, food production. So they're already looking at a wide variety of things that farms can deliver in any economy or in any society. There's societal issues, economic issues, you know, so farms are multidimensional in that respect. And I suppose we worked through the farming organizations, through the farm advisory services, through agricultural cooperatives, and there's no real challenge. Like 150 farmers nationally signed up and in training or delivering social farming is not huge, but I suppose when you reflect on it in your statement, Eamon, it is a quite significant number. But there isn't really a challenge in that. I think the challenges that we find are in mainstreaming it within, say, the mental health and disability service, because the challenges that face, there's waiting lists for a variety of health service. The social care support has been challenged. Everything has been challenged by recent COVID. The cost of COVID has really hollowed out many health services, such as increased waiting lists. And our main focus in social farming is supporting people with disabilities, really intellectual disabilities, physical and sensory, people who have had brain injuries or disease that has led to that. And of course, the mental health service. Mental health service is slightly different in that you have a crisis mental health intervention, which is absolutely necessary all the time. And so if you're looking at changing, say, the structural or funding dimensions of the health service to support a much more person-centered approach of social care or service, then it has to restructure how it operates and how it funds things. Because a lot of, in Ireland, people with disabilities don't have access to personal budgets as they do in many other parts of Europe. So policy change matters. And that's where we see more of a challenge, because there is a cost to providing the social farming support to an individual. It's much more important for the individual to make that choice. And under the United Nations Convention for People with Disabilities, they're entitled to the choice. And Ireland has just ratified that very late, actually, and has also put in place capacity legislation to allow people to express their choice. And it's very slow in providing the support for people to do that. And I suppose if that is followed then with individualized budgets and disability service, people will really choose to carve out their own path in the kind of supports they get on a day-to-day or weekly or monthly or yearly basis, as opposed to take the prescribed approach that currently exists in Ireland. So a lot of the issues in terms of allowing people choice, and job carving is all about choice, person's choice, a person's own interests. And so it's very individual. And I think that policy change, structural funding changes need to be cognizant of allowing the choice to be expressed and then providing the support to do that. And as you said, Annette, at the beginning, it's a horizontal process, because if you allow somebody the choice first, you have to support that choice and make sure that it's implemented, and then help to carve out the job. And then in the job, evaluate on an ongoing basis, for a year, 2 or 3 even, with both the employer and the individual to see that it's working, and continue to modify here and there. So it's a horizontal process that requires resources, really, and time and people. It has to have a person who understands the employer and the employee and be able to support them, and that does cost some money, as opposed to just ticking a box, putting employment and closing the book.
Thank you, Brian. Perhaps just finally, you mentioned helpful at the end there, clearly the need for resources, which is always a requirement for any kind of program. I was speaking to a colleague recently from the Netherlands who mentioned that the social farming movement now appears to be also gaining some traction in the Netherlands as well. I just wondered if you could perhaps share with us what you think may be a couple of the enabling factors to enable these kind of initiatives to kind of take off, really. So I wonder if there are any common factors in the Irish Republic and the Netherlands, which are 2 countries that I've discovered are involved in social farming. Are there things there that perhaps are unique to those countries, or are there things that you think perhaps could be used across a number of other countries as well to generate more interest in social farming and more activity?
Yeah, I'd say from our perspective, anyway, from what I've seen, is you have a set of common values that certainly are reflected in where I've seen this work, and in Ireland and in Holland, Netherlands, and in Flanders, Belgium. And the values are, some of the things that have been spoken about here, and probably we'll hear more about, is, the person-centered view, providing the support necessary for people, because in the short term, you may have to spend a bit more on that, investing in people, but in the long term, you won't have to invest as much in that person over their lifetime. Inclusion, the inclusion is so important, and equity, treating people, somebody who needs more support must get more support. People who need less support get less support. So equity is vital. And, not just equality, but equity. So these are the kind of values that we would see and espouse in what we do. And, and those who need most must get more, and those who are less able, to speak and to advocate for themselves need that more. So inclusion, that's what inclusion is all about, and equity. And those are the kind of things, and there are many other values. Participation, so somebody must be able to participate in their own, if they're making real choices, they must be participating themselves actively, and that means people being allowed to speak and build the capacity to speak. I've seen people who've been with disabilities who've been in institutions, residential institutions or support institutions for a long time, and they lose their own voice. So you do have to have that built in as a value to allow people to express it, even if it's not what you want to do, or if it costs a whole lot more. It must be, the opportunity to do that must be there. And those are the kind of values, Eamon, that are certainly common, and they're not necessarily built into the commercial view of life, and in many cases to the statutory view, because it's short-term, short-term interventions that seem to matter most, some of the time at least. So those values are certainly vital, and I see them work where things are most successful. I see those at the heart of what happens. And that applies, it's not just to social farming or care farming, but across the board for interventions like this. Yeah, and I suppose people who are really committed and understand what they do and learn from what they do. You've got to be able to learn, because we've learned so much over the years, and have to adjust and learn from the mistakes as much as anything else, and to improve what you do. So I think those kind of, and these kind of forums where we share what we find and what has worked and what hasn't, because you're moving, life is dynamic and it's messy, and in order to tease that out, you have to be resilient enough to be able to get on top of it and to learn. Some people get stuck, and that can be an issue, and that can apply equally to charities and people working on the ground as it can to institutional or statutory processes. So those are the things, maybe.
Thank you, Brian. That's very interesting. So, I think probably most people would agree that ultimately values are fundamental to the success of any kind of social program, which is a very, very helpful message. Thank you very much. I'd like to move on perhaps to bring in some of our colleagues from Malta. Particularly job carving in Malta has been driven very much through a very successful partnership between non-governmental organisations and the government of the country. And perhaps I'd like to now bring in our colleague Esmeralda, if she could give us a bit of background as to how her organisation first became involved in this, what's now been a long-standing and very successful partnership with the government in Malta. So how did it begin? How did you approach them, and perhaps what was the initial response when you first knocked on the door and said, I've got this really great new idea, job carving? How did it kick off? Thank you.
Thanks, Eamon. Well, the foundation is, as you said, rightly said, is part private and part public, therefore with the government of Malta. And it all started up during the time when Malta was enforcing the quota law, which is the 2% law of private industry requiring persons with disability. And the idea was that the private industry at the time was having discussions with the government and saying, what if we do it hand in hand with setting up a foundation that will also roll out services to companies, rather than just enforcing a law by itself. We're also rolling out the services for these companies to utilize, and in tandem with that, services for persons with disability that want to be employed. That's where it all began. And that has been a good 5 years ago now, turning 6 very soon. And it has been a huge success, because we've managed to synergize both the private and the public worlds, if you may, and in some way, fashion or form, we've been highly successful with our clients being moved into employment at rates which are incomparable to what they were in the past.
Thank you. So what are the main components in your initiative that have enabled these impressive results to be achieved then? What do you think are the ingredients that have really enabled it to kind of be so successful?
I wouldn't like to purport to say that we've got some magic wand that would fit and work everywhere, because we've been invited in a number of European countries, and we've shared best practices of ours, which might be slightly tweaked in order to shape and fit the right sector or country that we're in. I've taken some notes from what Miguel was saying in the initial introductory. Anette, we are good old friends now, together with yourselves. We've met a number of times. I think we've managed to create a holistic approach, whilst at the same time, the way I'm seeing the holistic approach is mostly client-centered. So the person with disability at the heart of all that it is that we're doing. However, with the same importance, we kept the importance of business and the fact that an employer needs to be motivated to employ a person with disability, and that ultimately their motivations, apart from values, which everyone will agree that the values are important, they want to be able to justify the employment of a person with disability and justify the numbers and the pounds, pence and shillings, if I may. So we've managed to find an interesting balance there, because we've kept both spheres in mind.
Are there any tensions between balancing the absolutely paramount interests of the individual and the commercial and reasonable commercial, obviously, interests of the employer? Are there any things that you need to reconcile there? Sometimes any issues that need to be addressed before they're prepared to start engaging with you to join the program?
It's continuous struggle, if you may, because you've got the person with disability that maybe has high expectations that do not match their current reality, and those are a struggle related to the person. But then you've got the company that expects some sort of performance that is not possible with a vulnerable person with a disability. So we continuously bump into these struggles. However, given the time and the space for them to try out without too much financial damage, therefore thanks to the incentives that are applied as well, the employer is then convinced that they are gaining performance and they are gaining traction on whatever it is, the job that we would have negotiated with the current employer for this employee. So yes, the struggles are never absent.
Your organization actually can help employers redesign some of their processes to kind of mean they can incorporate somebody with a disability or some employability issues into their organizations. How does that work? What kind of services do you do for them to show them how they can incorporate somebody with perhaps limited capability into their organization and make the organization more successful? How does that work?
That forms the largest part of the kind of carving we do in Malta. In fact, we've got a unit of corporate relations executives, which have a database of clients. In their case, the clients are private enterprises, and they visit them. They regularly visit them, and they create relationships with them. That is when the negotiations start on the floor as to what jobs might be included, new jobs, which we help carve together with the employer so as to fulfill requirements or maybe to fit the profile of the candidates we have at the moment in our database. So that is the major, the vast amount of carving that we do. It's based on both the needs and the aspirations and talents of the person with a disability, but it's also in tandem with the negotiations with the actual company.
Thank you. This is interesting. It's a kind of real win-win relationship, I think, that echoes the points made by Brian in his intervention as well, and also Annette's points at the start of the discussion. So there's clearly a lot in it for both parties, which is the ideal kind of basis for this kind of program or activity. Are there any, I know, as you said, Esmeralda, there aren't any magic wands perhaps, or golden bullets, and things are different in every situation, but are there any kind of 2 or 3 really kind of fundamental factors you think are very, very key to the success of a job carving program? Things you think that would perhaps travel across any country and with all sorts of sectors, really, if you do them right? 2 or 3 absolute kind of golden rules for job carving. We had a few from Miguel in Canada, but any that you've got?
Yes, I think it's first and foremost, I think what has worked very well for us, LSF in Malta, is separating the executives that work with persons with disability and the executives that work with the employers need different training and background. So they need to be tuned in a different way in order to bring out the best from both worlds. Then the marriage is made internally. So the information is taken from the person with disability, their skills, abilities profile, and all the guidance and requirements that we would have given them until then, which is pre-employment. Then we've got the corporate executive that does the work with the actual business, that has the right polish and the right training to enter the sector and understand the sector and build relationships with the employer. And then internally, we create our matches. And we found that separating the executives, if you may, from a training perspective, not anything else, because physically we are very close to each other, and that's what makes it work in Malta. But that has helped a lot. I think flexibility is extremely important. Flexibility both from the person with the disability, their ability to open their mind to different opportunities and not just assume they want an office job, for example. Why an office job? You can do a number of other things. And so being open and helping them to motivate themselves to look beyond what they thought was the job they wanted is also an important aspect of flexibility. Whilst flexibility on the side of the enterprise as well, whereby they are aware that the job will start off looking like a square, but it might turn out to be a triangle, and we need to pace the person with a disability as we go by. And maybe the third and maybe even most important is the job coaching service that we also give on top of all the carving and all the pre-work and pre-employment work. The job coaching definitely makes a huge difference to job retention, job satisfaction, and performance. So without that, you are left pretty much, guessing whether your carving worked and whether the matching worked and whether the employer is happy. So job coaching helps to maintain that triangulation of communication.
Thank you. And there's a degree of aftercare when somebody is placed with an employer as well. So your organisation are available if there are any kind of subsequent issues that need to be resolved as well. So that's
yes, the corporate executive is like the auditing partner, if you may, of the client, of the company, and they're the ones they go back to whenever they have issues related to employment and disability.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like perhaps to bring in one of the employees from Malta. When Miguel and I were thinking about job carving, we thought it would be fantastic to get an employer's perspective. We had some thoughts about the kind of sectors an employer might be from, and we were really, in the best sense, really pleasantly surprised to discover we had an employer from a gymnasium, which is fantastic. And it really wasn't on our kind of radar for what we thought maybe one of the employers involved in the initiative. So perhaps if I could then bring in Matthias for a couple of observations as well from an employer's perspective, that would be fascinating. Thank you very much, Esmeralda, for those really interesting observations. Matthias, as somebody organising a gymnasium, how did you first get interested in job carving? How did this happen?
Perfect. So basically, I was introduced to the Lino Spiteri Foundation because a relative of mine, a very close relative of mine, even, is a person with disability. So throughout the years, I can say, I could see, I could sense the sort of help he was getting, the sort of coaching, support he was getting in order to find an employment in which now he has been for like a couple of years, approximately 6 to 7 years. So you can imagine what sort of impact this help from the Lino Spiteri Foundation had on him and also on us as his family. You can imagine how how worried we can be when we see this person growing up being unemployed. So thankfully for the past several years, this has been solved. And as all of us know here, especially during COVID and right after COVID, the world has evolved even when it comes to remote working and stuff. And we came up with this idea that even though some social media platforms offer, for example, auto captioning on videos that are happening in English and in some other few languages, this function, this feature isn't available in our native language, which is Maltese. So we came up with this idea of approaching the Lino Spiteri Foundation to help us find someone who could literally spell Maltese in a brilliant way and write down these subtitles for us so that we can use for marketing purposes, for example. Now, to give you the whole picture, this sort of idea happens in the freelance world. There are several websites out there who offer these kind of freelancers or employees, call them whatever, who can work remotely with any other company. And but basically, of course, apart from not being able to find someone, or maybe being harder to find someone who can speak and write in Maltese, other than that, we wanted to support someone, as Esmeralda mentioned, this is also a bit of a game of values, who we believe could make a huge difference in their own personal life as well, you know. So this wouldn't be just another job for this particular person, but it can be their main source of income. So we thought that it would be a good idea. Even better so, as Esmeralda said, we also got the opportunity to try out this person before we could offer maybe a longer term collaboration or anything. So especially through this trial period and also through the funding that we received, it made it very easy for us to try things out first before deciding over before deciding for the long term, basically. I wanted to point out just a little bit of what Esmeralda mentioned, the support that we also get as employers from the Lino Spiteri Foundation, basically. So we have a point of contact, or even more than one, to be honest, where we can have these mediators, basically, who are working on site with the person with disability from their own office over there in Imsida. And whenever there is an issue in communication between us and the employee, the Hospitali Foundation is there to help us facilitate a lot the communication. Apart from that, they offer the person coaching in their own site, so giving us even more room to operate over here, because as we know, COVID has created even social distancing issues, so even more space is created for us to work even better. And what's better than having a coach basically coaching our own employee, and this employee is being actually, we are being subsidized by the Spiteri Foundation for employing this employee. So I believe the way things are set up are working brilliantly, not just for us, but for other employers, and I believe that can truly work. Also, Eamon, I want to praise publicly here as well for another reason, the Spiteri Foundation. Even when during COVID we had to temporarily suspend the services of this employee, just as we had to stop a couple of staff, unfortunately, due to the forced closure, the force majeure that we experienced over here as well. The executive taking care of our case, basically, even in his communication with us simply via email, he wasn't just like, okay, let's stop this contract for now and we'll see what happens later. He was actually like, fine, we totally understand the situation. Neil, because that's the name of our employee, is looking forward to restarting with you as soon as you reopen. So sometimes even a shift in language can make a huge difference. No wonder that these executives are well trained by the foundation. So thumbs up to that.
Thank you. Are there any kind of particular challenges that you've had to kind of overcome? And clearly you've dealt with them successfully, but were there any kind of slightly unexpected things that occurred when you first became involved in this relationship, and things that you've learned from that would be interesting to share and perhaps other employers could be aware of so they can have the same kind of success you've had? So things that didn't quite go according to plan or unexpected occurrences. Of course, COVID was a mega one, but any others kind of perhaps less global and devastating perhaps that have occurred that you had to deal with?
Yeah, so luckily for us, Seaman, because we had these mediators or moderators, there weren't any major issues, you know. So Neil's tasks are quite straightforward. I mean, he works on his laptop or on his computer, and whatever can be done on a PC, he's basically able to do most of the time. So we didn't have any major issues with that. What I would totally recommend is, this is just for all employees actually, but I think in particular in the case of people with disability, where we have created manuals, even video demonstrations of how the tasks should be done. So we demonstrate in a way that the employee can refer to even later on, so that whenever in doubt, even before asking us, even before reaching out, he can refer to these manuals. Some are written, some are in video format, so that he can easily, possibly, figure out the solution, which he has clearly done over and over again. So yeah, sometimes creating manuals can go a very long way to ease things out for everyone else.
Thank you. Perhaps finally, Matthias, if you are a very good advocate for job carving from an employer's perspective, but in terms of actually promoting job carving and recommending it to other employers who may be less familiar or perhaps haven't heard of the approach before, what would you say to them are the kind of real benefits of job carving for you as an employer? How would you say this is a really good thing to do from your experience?
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. So working remotely is clearly the way to go nowadays, you know, because of social distancing and all the changes that brought up here. For example, locally, we have a major issue with car traffic. So the less we are on the roads, the better even for the environment even. So yeah, you know, when you have the luxury of having people working with you from their own home or maybe from some office, I mean, it's beneficial to all, especially even if need be, we can communicate through sources like this, like Zoom or other platforms, basically. So, I mean, it's the way to go. In our particular case, we needed people who work in the IT sector. I mean, just like Neil, our employee. So it was even easier for us. But there are so many things that could be done over a simple tablet or a device or a PC that as employers, we can totally benefit from this situation, especially given the fact that we are also funded here locally, makes it even easier and more sustainable.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to perhaps open up the discussion a bit more widely. Thank you very much, Matthias, for a very interesting contribution. We've heard about the fact that clearly there is the possibility of funding to support job carving. We've discussed the fact that changes in the world of work are making this kind of approach to employment perhaps more timely and attractive. We've heard, of course, there can be great benefits, both from the perspective of the individual and the wider economy, particularly the rural economy, and also how a very sound infrastructure and partnerships, not least between government and non-governmental organisations, are all key to making this happen. But I'd like to perhaps open a discussion about perhaps perspectives or views colleagues have got about what needs to change to take advantage of all these potential opportunities and perhaps make job carving a more prominent part of the economy. Perhaps, Annette, could I bring you in first, if I may? Have you got any views about where policies at the moment don't really quite fit what we really want to achieve and which are preventing all of these excellent kind of examples from being more widespread than they are? Have you seen anything from your analysis you think this really isn't working and this is what we need to do differently?
Yeah, I would start with the values which have been brought up by our colleague from Limerick, because I think this is something which often clashes with the business world, let's put it that way. And I think what is needed is a kind of a shift. We are all responsible of our colleagues, yeah? And as it was expressed by Brian, you know, if there is need for support, people should get the support. It's not a thanks to the companies to, you know, employ someone. It's a win-win. They get a lot of really strengths and talents. And I think this change of perspective, I don't see in Europe. Yeah? It's not existing. It's always like pressure put on in particular the social side. And if it comes to vulnerable groups, you know, you can't just place one by one the metrics of productivity on all the different worlds in the social field. It just doesn't work. we are human beings. We need to take care on others. So this is more kind of a plaidoyer for solidarity, or for also, you know, taking it. We all have to have responsibility over our colleagues and over our friends. I would just I mean, this answers a bit, I hope, your question, but I would like to bring in another aspect, which I think came too short in the discussion so far. It's a kind of the pitfalls of the approach, because also here, I think we need to be careful whenever we are aware of that they exist, then of course you can already prepare and work for it. And when we made the analysis, we figured out that there is a kind of a risk associated with job carving, which is the downgrading of the jobs or the profiles or the positions which are carved. Now, I just would like to know from my colleagues whether this is something which they also experienced and what they would do in order to prevent that. Because this now goes into one specific vulnerable group, female with persons with, which often are then hit more in this regard, because easy tasks are carved in too easy to fulfill tasks within a company are carved out. And that's why, you know, it's easier to then, give this to a new person. And then that's why the salaries are lower than it was before. It's just something where I'm curious about what are the activities done in this regard in order to prevent this risk of downgrading. But this, I mean, sorry, Iman, if I'm asking a question, but I hope you allow.
No, that's very
such a
much
nice
the
discussion
intention.
that I wanna know whether the colleagues have some insights here.
No, thank you. No, it's very much the intention is to actually generate these kind of questions. That's very helpful. And I think you raised a very interesting point, because clearly job carving is intended to enable people who would have perhaps been permanently in some kind of sheltered workplace. And some do a great job, but there's often others where people are locked in without much chance of progression and often in kind of fairly low wages. And this is an opportunity for people to participate in the open labour market with an employer in all sorts of organisations. But perhaps would Esmeralda, one of your colleagues, be able to give us an insight as to what you do or what you can do to make sure that it is actually an opportunity and not, unfortunately, an exploitative type relationship because of the nature of the job being carved out, perhaps being low paid, low status, and not offering a great advancement for the client involved?
I'd like to start from the premise that what helped us gain repetition and traction on the local labor market was the fact that we put aside the word charity and we put aside the word values, and we said we are going to find individuals that can do the job that we've negotiated together. And that was a first step to gain dignity for persons with disability, especially vulnerable persons with disability, not just any disability, but the ones that actually require help in order to be able to find employment. And putting aside charity and too much talk about values has helped us build a case for these individuals that gains dignity on their behalf. So whilst I understand that we need to be pushing the value agenda, from the business perspective, the value agenda actually it's a double-edged sword. So my experience coming from the business world wouldn't work with me, that talk, and it certainly doesn't work with a number of employers that I am aware of. So I've taken a different tact altogether. When it comes to vulnerable persons with disability, which are the kind of clients we have, we're talking about people that have low levels of education, probably never worked a job in their life, and if they have worked very low-level jobs. So when we do carve jobs for these individuals, we're carving low-level jobs. So it's not a clerk, it's an assistant clerk. It is not a receptionist, it's an assistant or a receptionist support. So they are already low-level jobs, without wanting to sound offensive. Therefore, what we do make sure, though, is that they are paid within legal parameters, and that they are given healthy contracts, and that they are given a good head start in the local labor market. Because what we are doing over the years then is the same individual A that entered as an assistant clerk with a minimum wage or slightly above minimum wage 2 years ago We have now negotiated that they can take on more tasks, they can up their game, and therefore they might be owed an extra notch in their salary and package. And this is what we are looking at now moving forward with most of the employees that we have found a job for. And job retention, by the way, in the labor market, ever since we started, is at 86%. Therefore, whoever we've made active is still active in terms of 86% of them. And we're looking at now career progression or package augmentation, if you may, by adding tasks and negotiating different work tasks. I don't know if this is the answer you wanted to hear, but I'm giving you the answer employers want to hear, which I feel is the way to win the battle.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very, very interesting and informative answer. So I think what we've got there is the possibility of an ongoing relationship with clients to help them in their progression in an organization potentially. And as an employer becomes more aware of the potential to kind of be creative about their job design, they can see opportunities for more advancement amongst people who've joined at perhaps a lower rank to be involved in a job with more responsibility. And you also mentioned social protection and making sure that people are getting jobs under the correct kind of employment requirements in a particular country. So
because in that way they are protected by law then, and they are just another employee, just like all the others, and not someone who we're making a favor to for a couple of months.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question, Eamon?
Please do.
I'm sorry, I don't want to.
Yes, absolutely.
For sure. I think we all heard now that it's quite crucial also what skills the staff has in your organizations. They need to be kind of able to talk to employers, but at the same time, I mean, it's different staff members then maybe, but you need to kind of have a good skill infrastructure in your own staff to cater to both sides. People with disabilities or vulnerable people, but at the same time also have someone who understands about business views and is not only charity driven. So where do you find those people? Brian and Esmeralda, where are they?
That's the $1 million question, because stuff is hard to come by, especially at the moment. However, what we do is we include a few metrics of recruitment. Our recruitment style is different when recruiting for different positions. So we are aware that you need a level of empathy, a level of care, a level of maybe profiling skill or flair. When it comes to dealing with persons with disability, you might need a certain amount of experience. Whereas when we are recruiting individuals that are going to work in business and who are going to represent us within the businesses, and they are going to negotiate jobs on behalf of persons with disability, what we're looking after is people that can have communicative skills which are slightly more distinct, that have writing capacities that are more distinct, maybe a background in recruitment, maybe a background in any customer facing at a certain level. And the comportment, the way they come across and the way they behave in the interview are all markers that we jot down in order to see whether this person can actually exhibit the right level of trust to the right level of customer.
Thank you. Perhaps Brian, would you be able to share with us your kind of requirements for the kind of criteria you use to recruit staff in your organisation and network? So, and what the kind of backgrounds are of the people who've joined you in Ireland?
Yes, very, very similar things to what Esmeralda has said. You know, you're looking for somebody who can engage people or business in the way that's needed. You know, there's a lot of support needed for some individuals. So, you know, the person-centric engagement and approach from people. And really the background or qualification is not necessarily as important as the experience and what they've done to date and what they can show they have done. So very much, I'd maybe go back a step to the first conversation there, and what Esmeralda said, you know, we don't speak about the values necessarily as much, and we take charity out of it. Certainly that would be the case if you deal with people as they are. You know, there's no charitable activity in that. You're dealing with people, you're dealing with the challenges they have, and that shouldn't have to or need charity. It's the same as if you're approaching a high-level corporation or an executive in those as, you know, everybody is treated the same. That's what equality, equity, and inclusion means. So I agree there very much so. But what I would say is, when you're talking about values, you have to see what is of value as well, and that's a different thing. And you have to see that supporting people is valued and has a value, because say, for instance, if you look what has happened in the UK with the truck drivers, you know, there's a push to the bottom in terms of the terms and conditions, the pay that they had, but they have a real value in the supply chain, the logistics for everybody's life. And until that was really hit, nobody values it necessarily. And so somebody has to value it now, because you see a breakdown in the system of supply. And it's the same with any particular position in any company. Every position has a real value to the company, and it's only when it's challenged that that becomes obvious. And I suppose that's what I would say in looking at this. And if that position is valued to some extent, when that company is carving it out, they will see that a person has a place. Every person has a place in their company. Every person is valued in their company, and everybody has the opportunity to step up into the next, progress in their roles, learn, take on more responsibilities. And that's the values you need to see in a company that will take these things on and work with them. And, you know, that's what really matters as much as the nature of the role in itself. Obviously, you have to meet the legal requirements. Nobody should have to work for less than the minimum wage. There are poverty traps, though, between the welfare system, and that can trap people. And there is that sense in society that people in there are not valued, and that's a problem too. So there, and that's what exclusion is in many ways, you know, and that needs to be challenged as much as anything. And I think that the work you're doing there, Esmeralda, and your project and Matthias, is really showing that everybody has a value in society, regardless of what the role is. And that's what matters as much.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you very much. I think Matthias wanted to come in, please. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so just to add something short related to the value part, as an employer, for example, in my case, the same tasks that Neil is doing, for example, can be done by several other people who are IT literate. However, another value which we are getting is the fact that he is focused on those tasks specifically. So these tasks are given priority thanks to this employee, because he is specifically focused on doing them. So they are done better and they are done faster than if anyone else who has several tasks to perform can ever will. So that's a huge advantage for us as well.
Thank you very much. We've had lots of interesting insights on perhaps the language that's used. I think Esmeralda made a very good point that perhaps some of the language that's traditionally used is quite negative and labels people and can compromise the success of a discussion before it starts. And maybe in policy terms, we need to stop talking so much about vulnerable people and promoting the kind of negatives really inadvertently, and talk a bit more about what people can contribute without the kind of inferred negative perspective.
Even if I may give an example,
yes,
you know,
please.
we've worked with a number of business owners, very successful entrepreneurs, old school business owners, who would refer to our clients as boys and girls, kids, you know, those kids, we want to help them. And I just thought, we're never going to start, you know, if these people are going to keep on referring to these as poor kid who needs help, you know, I thought, I'm never going to be able to convince them that these people can learn, and they are going to learn and they're going to perform. So we had to turn the whole thing on its head, you know, and it was slow, it was painful, but yeah, we got there somewhat. So that's what I meant by removing the value and the charity part of it, because many people would say, oh, yes, I always try to help these people. No, we're not telling you to help. We're telling you, let's create a job and he can actually work for you. And you can give him a salary and a full-time contract. So thank you for qualifying it.
No, that's very helpful. And I think that raises again a point that Brian made, that somehow the terms of debate need to change, because again, we had an example from Ireland where there are essential jobs that need to be done that aren't being done, that are all about environmental sustainability, sustaining the rural economy. And if these things are not done, there'll be great adverse consequences for everybody, not least decision makers, politicians and governments. But unfortunately, we're moving into the last kind of 10 minutes. These things always seem to go far too quickly. But has anybody got a view about what more can be done to change the overall terms of debate? I mean, Esmeralda's made some very good points about engagement with employers and changing employer attitudes, which is obviously very essential, successful and sensible. But at the moment, a lot of these kind of very excellent initiatives are still seen as something potentially on the sidelines, very good, but not necessarily mainstreamed. Given all of the kind of essential needs that your different organizations achieve or serve, how can we actually move this more into the mainstream so it's not seen as something interesting and niche, but something that's quite normal, really? Why shouldn't all employers be thinking about carving jobs? And why shouldn't there be a much higher profile for social enterprises for the work they do? Anybody got any views on that? So how a discussion on the subject would not perhaps be considered so different and alternative? Matthias, yes, you had a wanted to come in.
Yeah, so just a quick idea. Basically, if as employers we can be approached and we are maybe asked to compile a couple of key skills or key values that we got out of such programs. Like, for example, in my case, we've got people who could write in perfect Maltese in a fast pace, for example. And so we can create advertising material faster, so it would reach even more people. You know, these sort of benefits that we got as employers would be fantastic, and maybe these benefits can be mailed out to other employers in the same industry. So, as Esmeralda said, I'm pretty sure many industries are informed in this. So, emailing people within the same industry, such as, for example, in our case, the fitness industry, might make it even easier for them to see the value in employing.
Thank you very much.
Candidates. Yeah.
Thank you. Annette, perhaps could I put you on the spot? Have you got any ideas about how job carving could be more of a mainstream activity?
Yeah, maybe I just come in again with a bit of the bad cop, because when I think of the beginning, when Miguel started, he said that he is carving his job on since he started working. And of course, all of us do that. So I don't know whether we are not in the, like, for people who let's say, yeah, at least have positions where they can carve, because there is the big difference. It's always the question of, are you allowed to or not? Carving is something, yes, I would say I've done this too. So we have it somehow in the mainstream, but the question for me would be more, how can we raise responsibility at the employers and also at the employee side that it's necessary to really ongoingly, you know, carve the job. It's not something which is, you know, as you said, Iman, something for a specific group, a side effect which needs to have to be supported by a lot of funding from the public. No, it's a regular business, let's say, in order for all of us, for all employees of the whole world to stay healthy, because this is a part which we did not discuss so much. Job carving also helps in terms of health issues, so that it's like kind of a healthy aging, you could also say, on the long run. So there is this need for all employees, and some specific areas need public support. But the awareness needs to be reason that we have to do this. There is a negotiation between employees and employers ongoingly in order to really best match your task, your position, your role within each job you do.
So perhaps it's something about values and making people to think a bit more creatively about what employment means and the purposes of a job, and the dignity of certain roles for both people, employing people and people kind of undertaking tasks for them. Yeah, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're heading right towards the end of our allotted hour and a half, and I've got to be diligent in the timekeeping, so I'll bring back Miguel perhaps briefly for some concluding comments. But one thing that occurred to me was many countries around Europe have these kind of levies or fines for employers who are not employing a certain quota of people who have been labelled as having disabilities, perhaps. Often many employers seem historically to be quite content to pay the levy or the fine rather than being more creative in recruiting people. And maybe the approach in Malta is very interesting, quid pro quo, where people can see not only that they can avoid paying a levy, but there's a benefit from them in actually recruiting somebody from a quote unquote vulnerable group. So perhaps it'd be interesting to see if that kind of initiative doesn't become more common in the future as the very good examples we've heard about this morning become more well known. Well, I'd like to thank you very much for a fascinating discussion. Thank you for your time. And I'll just hand back to Miguel for some concluding remarks for our last couple of minutes. Thank you, Miguel.
Thanks, Eamon, and thank you all for sharing all your views. It was very interesting and detailed. So I think that we have a lot of good information together and some examples. So I'll just make an attempt to highlight the things that I heard. We said right from the beginning, and said it many times, that job carving as a concept needs to be holistic. It is a process. It's not something that happens at a particular time and then it's done, but it requires follow-up, it requires preparation, it requires accompaniment in the different steps with the employer, with the job seeker, and it's something that is an investment really for the stakeholders involved. We also said that it's probably an investment, a more intense investment in the beginning, but for the job seeker and possibly also for the employer, it will mean that later on you don't have to invest so much because it turns into something that can sustain itself, work contract, work condition that is applicable, and job satisfaction and participation in working life for the job seeker. You also said that partnerships are needed, that actually job carving is a pretty good way of bringing public and private together, which doesn't necessarily let's be honest, happen very often, or does not happen without challenges. So the examples we saw here, especially in Malta, are a way of bringing public and private together. You need to work on partnerships and relationships, that even something that European funds can help with. To facilitate it, but that's crucial to be successful. Then there is a pre-employment aspect to it. In the social farms, for example, it is maybe not straightforward employment, but it can be a step towards employment with carved jobs to help people get used to work again, to get them out and about, as Brian said, to bring them just closer to an environment where they can work, where they can bring in their own personality, and where they can relate to others and do something. And then there can be very concrete employment opportunities with a carved out task, like in the case of Matteo's gym, where they do a particular task which they do well, and they do maybe better than anybody else will do, because they have the time to do it and the skills to focus. So that was interesting. As rules, success rules, a couple more where we said that the staff skills are crucial. The way the communication is managed is crucial, away from the deficit-driven vocabulary to business, but not only business, but also job seeker, human-centered driven terminology. It's important to communicate not only with the clients, but also within the staff. I've seen settings in public employment services, for example, where you would have employer experts and job seeker experts, and they're both very good in what they're doing, but they don't necessarily communicate well with each other. So I think it's crucial to have like a language within the institution that does the job carving or facilitates it, that caters to business and job seekers and finds a common approach without preconceptions. And yes, I think finally, it's important to have in mind that there is a couple of risks in this job carving exercise and philosophy, and that's that we need to be careful not to downgrade jobs, while at the same time being realistic that we will not create high quality jobs for people who haven't worked in their lives and don't have a very high skill set, but that through rather low skill jobs, which are better than no jobs, will enter the job world and be able to work on their profile and then land at a better paid and more qualified jobs eventually later on. So this is basically what I heard. It's a possibility for inclusion and equity. It's a possibility to move away from making charity, giving out charity goodies, if I may call it like this, to really look at people's qualifications and open a gate for them to enter the job world in environments where they would normally not. And I think for that it's a great tool. So thanks for that. I'll be happy to continue the discussion. We will share this edited recording with a larger audience who is interested in it, and they might then also come back to you for further discussions. Thanks a lot. Have a good day.
Thanks. Good morning.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Ciao.
It's a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
It was a pleasure. Thank you. Bye.